Now the attendants of the senators carried clubs and staves which they had brought from home. But the senators themselves seized the fragments and legs of the benches that were shattered by the crowd in its flight, and went up against Tiberius, at the same time smiting those who were drawn up to protect him. Of these there was a rout and a slaughter, and as Tiberius himself turned to fly, someone laid hold of his garments. So he let his toga go and fled in his tunic. But he stumbled and fell to the ground among some bodies that lay in front of him. As he strove to rise to his feet, he received his first blow. As everybody admits, from Publius Satirius, one of his colleagues, who smote him on the head with the leg of a bench. To the second blow claim was made by Lucius Rufus, who plumed himself upon it as upon some noble deed. And of the rest more than 300 were slain by blows from sticks and stones, but not one by the sword. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, the tribune of that time, is brutally killed in riots which had developed after his attempt of reforming agrarian laws. The redistribution of land would have benefited the poor and taken from the rich. Now, this sounds like the typical Robin Hood narrative, doesn't it? Take from the rich and give it to the poor. Indeed, Tiberius Gracchus enjoys widespread popular support, especially among the small farmers, but he sows hatred among the wealthy landowners to the same extent. One man's gain is another man's loss, right? Tiberius' senatorial opponents are angered by what they perceive as unorthodox political tactics and see their wealth and influence in danger. So these guys conspire and one day decide to go and grab sticks and stones and whatever object they can get their hands on, chair legs as Plutarch tells us. They chase down Tiberius, who by the way is being protected by his supporters, and beat him to death. But according to Plutarch, they do not stop there and even brutalize his corpse. Quote, "The combination against him would seem to have arisen from the hatred and anger of the rich rather than from the pretext which they alleged. And there's strong proof of this in their lawless and savage treatment of his dead body. For they would not listen to his brother's request that he might take up the body and bury it by night, but threw it into the river along with the other dead." End quote. Okay, let's stop here for a minute and look at what we are being told here, shall we? Now, the practice being described here is horrific beyond belief. There's no doubt about that. I think we can all agree on this. But let us try to evaluate the situation from an ancient Roman contemporary standpoint. What on earth's name could have been the point of mutilating a deceased politician's body? Matter of fact, anyone's dead body, other than out of sheer hatred and wickedness, right? Why, when Gaius Tiberius' brother asks the murderers to surrender the body, would they reject his request and throw the body into the river? Now, with those questions in mind, let's move on to a similar incident, and maybe we'll be able to make the necessary connections that way. In 121 BC, Gaius Gracchus, being now some 30 years of age, 9 years after his brother's murder, Gaius Gracchus is elected to the tribunate in 123 BC and even re-elected the next year. His reforms are wide-ranging and designed to benefit all interests. Unfortunately, continuing his brother's legacy brought old political enemies onto the scene and created new ones. After losing the vote for a third year in office due to failures in various political matters, and loss of popularity in general, the situation escalates quickly. Gaius Gracchus' supporters hold an angry mass demonstration on the Aventine Hill. The fact that some of them carry weapons is perceived as a threat to the stability of the Roman state. The Senate therefore grant Consul Lucius Opimius, who happened to be Gaius's most prominent and most bitter rival, the Senatus Consultum Optimum, the order of the highest authority known to the Roman constitution. Opimius takes with him a militia, legionary infantry, and even some archers, and he's trying to restore order on the Aventine Hill. He and his men massacre around 3,000 of Gaius's supporters, and so Gaius, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, flees. Quote, "So then, as Gaius fled, his foes pressed hard upon him and were overtaking him at the wooden bridge over the Tiber, but his two friends bade him go on, while they themselves withstood his pursuers, and fighting there at the head of the bridge, would suffer no man to pass, until they were killed. Gaius had with him in his flight a single servant, by name Philocrates, and though all the spectators, as at a race, urged Gaius on to greater speed, not a man came to his aid, or even consented to furnish him with a horse when he asked for one, for his pursuers were pressing close upon him. He barely succeeded in escaping into a sacred grove of the Furies, and there fell by the hand of Philocrates, who then slew himself upon him. According to some writers, however, both were taken alive by the enemy, and because the servant had thrown his arms about his master, no one was able to strike the master until the slave had first been dispatched by the blows of many. Someone cut off the head of Gaius, we are told, and was carrying it along, but was robbed of it by a certain friend of Opimius, Septimulius. For proclamation had been made at the beginning of the battle that an equal weight of gold would be paid the man who brought the head of Gaius or Fulvius. So Septimulius stuck the head of Gaius on a spear and brought it to Opimius, and when it was placed in a balance, it weighed 17 pounds and 2/3, since Septimulius, besides showing himself to be a scoundrel, had also perpetrated a fraud, for he had taken out the brain and poured melted lead in its place. But those who brought the head of Fulvius were of the obscurer sort, and therefore got nothing." End quote. So again, we see the mutilation of dead bodies. Plutarch proceeds, and the following is very important. "The bodies of Gaius and Fulvius and of the other slain were thrown into the Tiber, and they numbered 3,000. Their property was sold and the proceeds paid into the public treasury. Moreover, their wives were forbidden to go into mourning, and Licinia, the wife of Gaius, was also deprived of her marriage portion." End quote. Okay, a lot of stuff to uncover here. Again, we learned that sometimes the dead bodies of Roman politicians who fell from grace are being mistreated, to put it mildly. And there are several more examples we could look at that prove this observation to be true. Pliny, for example, tells us that in some cases they would even perform exhumations just to deliver punishment even after death. This is one aspect of a concept referred to as poena post mortem, punishment after death. Interestingly, as a side note, the emergence of the practice of cremation is believed to, at least in part, be a consequence of this. Sulla, for example, would later have his body cremated, just to ensure his enemies would never get a hold of it. But back to our example at hand. As with Tiberius Gracchus before, the bodies of Gaius Gracchus and Fulvius Flaccus are being desecrated and disposed in the river Tiber. Why? As horrible as it sounds, in ancient Rome, the desecration of bodies and, in our case, disposal in the river, had a symbolic character. And we're not saying that hatred did not play a part in this. In fact, Plutarch mentions family feuds, such as that between Marius and Sulla, as motivations. But mainly the desecration of a politician's body was aimed at discrediting their term of office, and in case of the total loss of their body, also denying them any prospect of a ritual and honorable burial. Now, we have to keep in mind that the burial rites were an important occasion to establish and reinforce a deceased person's memory, their memoria, and their family's memoria as well. The denying of burial represents a form of condemnation of their memory, damnatio memoriae. And by the way, we'll look at burials in more detail later, but let's for now try to define the terms memoria and damnatio memoriae more precisely, because these will lay the foundation for our discussions throughout the show. Eric Warner in 2004 defines the terms very elegantly, so please allow me to quote his definition to make sure that we get things right before we move on. Warner writes, quote, "The term damnatio memoriae, literally the damnation or condemnation of memory, is modern, but it accurately reflects the Romans' preoccupation with the concepts of memory and fame. The Latin term memoria has much broader repercussions than its English cognate memory, and encompasses the notions of an individual's fame and greater reputation. The belief that a deceased individual enjoyed an afterlife through the perpetuation of his memory or by being remembered is at the core of Roman cultural identity, and is amply witnessed by the innumerable surviving works of funerary art and architecture created for all classes of the society throughout the empire." End quote. Okay, let's stop here for a second. So, we learned that in ancient Rome, a person's memory includes their individual fame and greater reputation, as Warner puts it. The Romans believe in an afterlife that you get to enjoy only if you're being remembered in this world, hence the immense efforts of leaving behind funerary art and architecture, which are other forms of memoria. Of course, as we can infer from our example of the Gracchi brothers, the body of a deceased individual bears a significant part of the memoria too. And this seems obvious and natural, right? Now, if you dispose someone's body and remove or destroy any kind of public statues, images, or inscriptions that might exist, it is almost as if the person never existed. Or is it? Warner writes, quote, "Cancellation of a bad emperor's identity and accomplishments from the collective consciousness was one of the fundamental ideological aims of damnatio in the imperial period. Portrait statues and busts were routinely removed from public and private display, and the names and titles of overthrown rulers were ruthlessly excised from the inscriptions that had formerly extolled their virtues." End quote. He goes on to name a few examples from the imperial period, and we're going to look at some of them later in this episode, but here comes an important bit for now. Warner writes, quote, "For representations of condemned emperors in the round, their removal from public display and subsequent storage in secure locations has often led, ironically, to their preservation for posterity. Indeed, Damnatio contributed directly to the warehousing of great numbers of imperial images." End quote. Interesting, right? Sometimes when you try to abolish the memory of someone or something, ironically, as Warner puts it, you achieve the exact opposite of what you intended to do. The idea that you simply remove a condemned emperor's image from public places and let everyone forget about them might have worked short term and to some debatable degree. But we learned that in the long run, this whole practice actually led to the warehousing of their images, right? And thereby preservation of their memoria. Now you might ask, why not simply destroy all the representations and get rid of the condemned person's memoria that way? Damnatio Memoriae only affects what happens to the public representations of condemned individuals. Keeping private images of the damnatus or talking about them was not prohibited. I mean, how could you possibly control what people talk or write about in private, right? Well, if you couldn't completely abolish someone's memoria from the history books, no matter how hard you tried, why does it seem like the Romans even bothered? The truth is, there's quite a lot of debate among historians about the intentionality of Damnatio Memoriae, and the definitions may vary. However, many historians argue, and I would actually agree on this, that Damnatio Memoriae was never really intended to remove someone's memory from history entirely. Egon Fleig and Charles Hedrick Jr. argue that instead, Damnatio was intended to establish and propel negative memory, to create an exemplum malum, as Frank Bernstein in 2023 puts it. So, by removing a well-known person's representations from public or mutilating their images and leaving them out for public display, they hope to dishonor that individual's memoria and perpetuate that negative narrative into the future. This explanation seems a lot more plausible if you ask me. Indeed, the notion of abolishing an individual's memory completely is a purely modern concept, as Michael Rathmann in 2014 points out. George Orwell's novel 1984 is probably the best known description of an almost perfect erasure of the past. Think about how the protagonist, Winston Smith, is threatened with the destruction of all memorial references to him. Quote, "Nothing will remain of you, not a name in a register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will never have existed." End quote. Being able to rule over history by destroying knowledge and manipulating it is quite the power fantasy, isn't it? From Orwell's dystopian novel, we learn how central to political rule the control of the past can be. This includes not only erasing but also rewriting and overwriting memory, as Gerald Schwedler 2021 emphasizes. And this is very important. We see that memoria is not a rigid concept. Rather, memory may transform in the context of political changes and is negotiated at various levels of Roman society. So, maybe let's look at an example real quick. Plutarch tells us how during the First Roman Civil War, Marius is declared public enemy and his memory is condemned by his enemy Sulla, who comes out on top of the conflict and establishes a dictatorship for 3 years. Let's look at how Marius Memoria, who had been pronounced public enemy under Sulla, is treated 20 years later during Julius Caesar's quaestorship. Quote, as nephew of Julia, the deceased wife of Marius, he, meaning Caesar, pronounced a splendid encomium upon her in the Forum, and in her funeral procession ventured to display images of Marius, which were then seen for the first time since the administration of Sulla, because Marius and his friends had been pronounced public enemies. When some cried out against Caesar for this procedure, the people answered them with loud shouts, received Caesar with applause, and admired him for bringing back, after so long a time, as it were from Hades, the honors of Marius into the city. End quote. So you have that guy Marius, who had once been declared public enemy. Now 20 years pass and suddenly it appears his Memoria is being rehabilitated, at least in part. Again, this indicates how we should never mistake collective memory as something fixed that will be perpetuated in a certain way forever and ever. Quite the contrary. Memory may be negotiated in a multitude of contexts, both publicly and privately, and always holds the potential for change. Okay, now you might ask, on a political level, who gets to decide which statues, images, inscriptions may be displayed in the public sphere, right? Well, let's hear what Pliny has to say about this. Quote, Lucius Piso has recorded that in the second consulship of Marcus Aemilius and Gaius Popilius, 158 before Christ, the censors Publius Cornelius Scipio and Marcus Popilius caused all the statues round the forum of men who had held office as magistrates to be removed, excepting those that had been set up by a resolution of the people or the Senate. While the statue which Spurius Cassius, who had aspired to monarchy in 485 BC, had erected in his own honor before the temple of Tellus, meaning earth, was actually melted down by censors. Obviously, the man of those days took precautions against ambition in the matter of statues also. End quote. According to Pliny's account from 158 BC onwards, so a year before Marius' birth year actually, carriers of memoria such as statues and monuments were to be legitimized by popular and Senate resolutions. In theory, of course, this wasn't always the case. Again, I find it important to stress that the public's or Senate's attitude towards the memoria of an individual may not always affect or change private sentiments which people might have. People might still hide images of a condemned person in their basement, right? Let's look at one of Cicero's countless defense speeches in court. The following one was delivered in 63 BC in defense of Rabirius accused of treason. Quote, Therefore it does seem a marvelous thing to me where you, O Labienus, found thus image which you have. For after Sextus Titius was condemned, no one could be found who would dare to have it in his possession. But if you had heard of that, or if from your age you could have known it, you certainly would never brought that image, which, even when concealed in his house, had brought ruin and exile on Sextus Titius, into the rostrum and into the assembly of the people. End quote. Cicero crushes this guy named Labienus, who, happens to be the tribune of that time and also head of the prosecution in this court case for carrying an image of Lucius Saturninus, a former tribune who had been stoned to death and been condemned. Cicero then stresses how Sextus Titius had to face exile for having an image of the condemned Saturninus hidden in his home. Cicero is like, "You Labienus, you got some nerve bringing this image to court, when people before you have been exiled just for having that image hidden in their home." What we learn from this court scene is publicly professing allegiance to a discredited bearer of Memoria can be detrimental to you. Okay, we've been talking about Republican accounts for some time now. Let's slowly transition to Imperial Rome now, when things really start to take shape. The civil war was over. Augustus celebrated the victory over Cleopatra and Antony as an act of salvation for the whole world. Conversely, according to his version, a victory for the enemy would have been tantamount to the end of the world. Helmut Halfmann, 2011, writes, "The decisive naval battle at Actium, Greece, between the two opponents of the Second Triumvirate, Marcus Antonius and Octavianus, finally seals the fate of the Roman Republic." From a military historian's standpoint, we should point out that, de facto, for Antony, the Battle of Actium is already lost before it ever begins. Indeed, from the point of view of the Antonine camp, it would be more accurate to use the term breakthrough battle. For Antony and Cleopatra, there's nothing to gain really at this point. Their combined fleet is trapped in the Bay of Actium. Supplies have been cut off both from land and sea, and Antony's men start to desert to Octavian's side daily. Considering the hopelessness of the situation, their only real option besides surrendering is to attempt a breakthrough. And they actually managed to pull it off. And so Antony and Cleopatra make it back to Alexandria together with their war chest, while the rest of their fleet is destroyed and the remaining men are either killed in battle or captured. Soon after Antony's escape from Greece, the Senate passes a resolution on his Damnatio Memoriae. Now, the exact dating of the sanctions against Antony's Memoria remains controversial in research. Two contradictory sources are used as points of reference. In the last paragraph of his Cicero biography, Plutarch claims that the decree came into force during the younger Cicero's consulship. So, anywhere between September 13 and November 1st, 30 BC. Cassius Dio, on the other side, writes that the necessary steps were taken immediately after receiving the first news from Actium. We don't know for sure which one of those two sources is correct, but we do know that Suetonius' biography of Augustus additionally has Antony declared hostis by the Senate, hostis meaning enemy of the state. And this claim is questionable as well. There are sources, however, testifying that Octavianus has Cleopatra declared hostis by the Senate. Charles Babcock noted as early as 1962 that the accounts of Cassius Dio appear more credible, and that Plutarch probably preferred dramatization to truthful chronology. This opinion is still supported by numerous voices in recent research. Eric Warner in 2004 and Harriet Flower in 2006 note that the sanctions against Antony's Memoria appear to have been in force before his death in Egypt. While Plutarch and Dio disagree on the chronology, they do agree in their description of Antony's damnatio. Both describe the destruction of his statues, the erasure of his name from inscriptions and documents, the declaration of his birthday as an erroneous day, dies vitiosus, and the punishment of his name, which meant that no Antonian was allowed to use the first name Marcus. It remains unclear to what extent the senators, in their enthusiastic expectations of the victor at Actium, may have extended the measures to Antony's ancestors by Senate decree. Halfman 2011 at least notes that the inhabitants of Clarus in Asia Minor, quote, in their overzealousness mistakenly chiseled out the homonymous name of his grandfather, end quote. The Senate resolution on the damnatio of Antonius was the first of its kind, an absolute novelty, meaning there hasn't been a clear-cut concept as to what damnatio encompasses and how it should be carried out up until this point in time, when Rome is about to leave the Republic behind and move into its imperial age. And there still isn't when they act upon Antony's Memoria, just to be clear. However, beginning with Octavian, who will become Augustus after his victory against Antony, the imperial age is when we see more pronounced ideas about damnatio memoriae emerging. So let's look at Antony's damnatio that will set a precedent for future damnationes in more detail, shall we? In his Cicero biography, Plutarch writes, quote, moreover, as soon as he, meaning Octavian, had finally defeated Antony, and when he was himself consul, he chose Cicero's son as his colleague in the office, and it was in his consulship that the Senate took down the statues of Antony, made void the other honors that had been paid him, and decreed besides that no Antony should have the name of Marcus. Thus, the heavenly powers devolved upon the family of Cicero the final steps in the punishment of Antony, end quote. In his Antony biography, Plutarch writes, but Caesar, although vexed at the death of the woman, admired her lofty spirit, and he gave orders that her body should be buried with that of Antony in splendid and regal fashion. Her women also received honorable interment by his orders. When Cleopatra died, she was 40 years of age, save one, had been queen for 22 of these, and had shared her power with Antony more than 14. Antony was 56 years of age, according to some, according to others 53. Now the statues of Antony were torn down, but those of Cleopatra were left standing, because Archibius, one of her friends, gave Caesar 2,000 talents, in order that they might not suffer the same fate as Antony's, end quote. Now we listen to Plutarch's account. Let's look at Cassius Dio's account of Antony's damnatio. Quote, at the beginning, then, they not only voted him these honors, but also either took down or effaced the memorials of Antony, declared the day on which he had been born accursed, and forbade the use of the surname Marcus by any of his kin. When, however, they learned of Antony's death, the news of which came while Cicero, the son of Cicero, was consul for part of the year, some held that it had come to pass not without divine direction, since the consul's father had owed his death chiefly to Antony. And they voted to Caesar crowns and thanksgivings in great number, and granted him the privilege of celebrating another triumph, this time over the Egyptians. For neither on the previous occasion nor at this time did they mention by name Antony and the other Romans who had been vanquished with him, and thus imply that it was proper to celebrate their defeat. End quote. The discrepancies between the literary sources on Antony's Damnatio, which we just listened to, and the epigraphic evidence as put forth by Warner, Oestenberg, and others, raises questions. The statues and portraits of Antony were apparently so thoroughly destroyed that not a single reliably identifiable portrait of the triumvirate still exists. This is particularly impressive, as Warner points out, as, quote, likenesses of Marcus Antonius were produced and widely disseminated after Caesar's assassination on 15 March 44 BC, and especially during his struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean with Octavian. Indeed, Paul Zanca has demonstrated how the two rivals waged virtual war of images. End quote. All that remains are merely 3 portraits from Egypt. They share some similarities and might depict Antony. If they really do represent Antony, they most likely have been removed from public display and been warehoused. And we talked about this paradoxon of damnatio before. His name is found in numerous inscriptions from diverse sites, contrary to Plutarch's and Dio's accounts, and even gains significance in various historical contexts over time. Augustus himself consistently concealed the name of his former rival in the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, which translates to the deeds of the divine Augustus, his autobiography. Nonetheless, the picture that emerges in research is of an Augustan regime that apparently pursued a partial rehabilitation of Antony's Memoria, at least for a time. After all, it is Octavian himself who rejects the Senate's solution for dealing with Antony's memory after his return from Egypt. Octavian becomes Augustus, and while not having all of Antony's honors restored, he has Antony's name re-entered in the Fasti Consularis Capitolini, the official consular lists. Antonius' name also remains unchanged in the Fasti Triumphalis Capitolini, the lists of military triumphants and their achievements. So we see that, contrary to what Plutarch and Dio mean to tell us about Antony's name and honors being removed entirely, we actually find his name appears or reappears in various contexts. But why is that? Why does Augustus restore, at least in part, the memory of his former rival Antony, which he fought to death during Rome's Third Civil War? So, why the rehabilitation of Antony's Memoria? Any answer to this question will be a complex one, I'm not gonna lie to you. We could delve into the topic from so many different angles, but I've chosen 4 of the most prominent aspects from the literature. The first one being auctoritas, the second being a departure from Hellenism, thirdly clementia and pietas, and the fourth one will be the Domus Augusta and Antonius' descendants. We will go over each of these aspects individually, but what we'll find is that they tend to overlap, and they all serve the same subordinate purpose, which is to help legitimizing and consolidating Augustus' newly achieved rule. The beginning of the Principate is accompanied by far-reaching political and socio-cultural changes, After his self-proclamation as sole ruler of the Roman Empire, Augustus needs to legitimize the new balance of power towards the Senate and the Roman Republic. One of the ways in that Augustus seeks to establish his position of power is the creation of auctoritas. Auctoritas refers to a concept suggesting the material, intellectual, and moral superiority of his person, as Galinsky 1996 defines it. Auctoritas is a quality that emanates from individuals. Augustus assumes the role of auctor, as described in Rome's Law of the 12 Tables. He becomes the guardian of applications, vouches for their legal validity, and decides on their acceptance or rejection on his own authority. In doing so, he always assumes sole responsibility for any potential consequences. Authority over the state is thus no longer subject to the Republican Constitution or the judgment of the Senate. It's solely at the discretion of a single person who claims to possess superior moral judgment. Images and literature that portray Augustus' rise to princeps for the public therefore depict him as a superior general and pacifier in the Civil War conflicts, as Paul Zanka 1987 shows us in his monograph, The Power of Images. Augustus' propaganda campaign also suggests that a higher providence has chosen him as the savior of Rome, and that he outlived his rivals for that exact reason. This is probably also one of the reasons why Octavian has Antony's name, both the triumvirate and his grandfather, which had been chiseled out during his absence, reinstated in the Fasti Consulares after his return. For their unbroken lists of names of office holders and dignitaries, which had already been kept for more than 4 centuries up to the day of his principate, was too important for the narrative of an Augustan determinism to accept defacement. The image of an, quote, unbroken republic, end quote, as Östenberg 2018 puts it, was to be maintained. Indeed, one might think that Augustus had restored the Republic with the symbolic act of reinserting Antony's name in the Fasti. At the same time, this act reflects the extent of Augustus's control over commemoration, at least in the urban Roman sphere, as Harriet Flower 2006 indicates. Augustus is the guy deciding whose memoria may be cultivated in public now. It's not so much the Senate anymore. Also, in the Fasti Triumphales, Antony remains unchanged, as his name shares some entries with Octavian. Erasures in these places, mind you, would also have diminished Augustus' own achievements. At first glance, the removal of Marcus Antonius from inscriptions may have been conducive to the concept of auctoritas. The memory of a rival who had stood in Augustus' way on the path to his autocracy would have been erased. But in more recent research, however, a different understanding of Damnatio Memoriae has emerged. Again, we have talked about this already, but I feel like there's no harm in repeating. According to this view, damnatio should not be misunderstood as the erasure of memory. Rather, it must be understood as the conscious establishing of negative memory. Charles Hedrick Jr., in the year 2000, draws attention to the paradox that surrounds the condemnation of memory. The absence of a name in inscriptions, such as the Fasti, attracts the viewer's attention all the more, and in this way reinforces the memory of the individual subjected to damnatio. In this way, shame and punishment could be cast on the target person, and this negative memory could literally be, air quote, engraved in stone. In research, it is disputed to what extent people in Rome were aware of this effect, and whether the actual intention behind damnatio was not in fact the erasure of memory. However, I would like to agree with Hedrick's reading and argue that Antony's contemporaries must have been well aware of this paradox. Not least because his portraits had been toppled and completely destroyed instead of leaving the defaced images in public for eternal shame and punishment. It simply served Augustus' cause better to remove the statues altogether, not because he wanted to erase the memory of Antony, but because Augustus had deliberately decided against commemorating the negative memory of an entire decade of civil wars. Attacking the statues of his rival and leaving them to public ridicule forever would only have perpetuated the painful memories of the war-weary Roman people for an even longer period of time. I think not least for this reason, he has Antony's name reinstated in the Fasti. Augustus was eager to create a new beginning. Also, any effort to erase the memory of the rival would have implied that Antony had once posed a threat to the emperor's auctoritas, and that it was not in fact inviolable. Indeed, this would have drawn attention to the emperor's potential vulnerability, which was constituted in the memory of his former rival. Conversely, Augustus is able to further strengthen his auctoritas through the partial restitution of Antony's memory, as this process conveys an undisputed superiority and thus consolidates his claim to power. Such a gesture also allowed opposition circles to be integrated in the new Augustan system, as Rathmann points out. Remember, Antony was very popular among the populace. The demotion of Antony's birthday to Dies Vitiosus, meaning corrupted or defective day, can certainly be seen in a similar light. As a side note, Oestenberg draws attention to the fact that Antony's birthday is the only Roman day with the designation Vitiosus. This circumstance gives rise to the assumption that there must have been disagreement regarding the handling of Antonius' Memoria. For both the Senate and the Princeps, the case represented an absolute novelty and stood at the beginning of a, quote, new political system, a monarchy that pretended to be a republic, end quote. The entry in the Fastiani marks January 14 as an unlucky day, even if the implicit message is interpreted negatively. It is nevertheless a form of commemoration of Antony's name. The fortification of Antony's name may also have strengthened Augustus' auctoritas as an invincible general and ruler to the same extent. In his view, he had saved Rome from the threat that was Antony. Augustus could afford to remember his former rival, for his predestination as savior and liberator of the Roman people had never been in question. In other words, everything that happened and how things turned out in the end, with Octavian ending the civil war and becoming Augustus, had always been meant to happen exactly the way that it did. Think about this. How could you possibly make anyone believe that you're the chosen one if you don't seem to believe in that narrative yourself, right? I mean, if you claim to be the chosen one, why would you have to worry about anyone getting into your way? Hence the restoration of Antony's name in those public lists. Now, we've talked about auctoritas and how it was important for legitimizing Augustus's newly achieved rule. And let's now look at another aspect, which was the departure from Hellenism, as I like to call it. The Augustan regime pursues a cultural agenda that is characterized by an increasingly negative attitude towards Hellenistic influences. Towards the end of the Republic, many conservatives are of the opinion that the influence of the Greek East had brought extravagance, moral decay, and decadence to Rome. And indeed, rich Romans enjoyed rich spoils of war in the course of the civil wars, which reinforced this impression. Therefore, within art, we see a revival of traditional Roman values, which is reflected in particular in religious and family motives. Overall, we see a departure from Hellenism in general culture, which from then on was only associated with decadence. Damnatio Memoriae itself has Hellenistic roots. Rathmann refers to what could be probably considered the best known example of Greek memory condemnation. The Macedonian king Philip V, as handed down by the Augustan historian Livy. Livy's descriptions show clear parallels to the practice of memory condemnation in Rome, and we find some aspects of what Livy describes in the case of Antony, and we will eventually come to know damnatio much more clearly with Augustus's successors. Rathmann, however, is critical of the view that the Hellenistic practice of memory condemnation had a decisive influence on the Roman one. In his argument, he refers to Marius and Sulla, quote, neither of whom was subjected to official damnation after their death, end quote. Now, it is true that neither Marius nor Sulla were subjected to damnatio by Senate decree. Nevertheless, I would like to take this opportunity to draw attention to the numerous traditions of conservative Romans mentioned in the beginning, and how they complain about the allegedly bad influence of the Greeks on Roman customs and traditions towards the end of the Republic. Let's look at one example here. Seneca, in his philosophical guide, De Ira, which translates to On Anger, writes, quote, would to heaven that such savagery had contented itself with foreign examples, and that barbarity and anger and punishment had not been imported with other outlandish vices into our Roman manners. Marcus Marius, to whom the people erected a statue in every street, to whom they made offerings of incense and wine, had, by the command of Lucius Sulla, his legs broken, his eyes pulled out, his hands cut off, and his whole body gradually torn to pieces, limb by limb, as if Sulla killed him as many times as he wounded him. End quote. Seneca's account of Marius' death and the way in which his corpse was treated is strongly reminiscent of the later widespread practice of desecrating corpses as part of damnatio. In the imperial age, we learn that this is done for the purpose of legitimizing power. And as a side note, I know this is a sensitive topic, but if you're interested and you want to read more on what symbolic meaning an emperor's corpse had for the Romans, and you want to learn more about the imperial age practice of consecratio, I highly recommend reading Christiane Kunst's work on this matter. Now, back to where we left off. Remember how Sulla ordered his corpse to be burned at the end of his own life for fear of retribution. We briefly talked about this in the beginning of this show. The practice of desecrating corpses was thus already apparent in the late Republic and became a frequently used means of justifying claims to power in the imperial period. If Seneca's descriptions are to be trusted, an allusion to Homer's Iliad may well be inferred from the source, especially since Homer's Iliad was compulsory reading in the education and training of the Roman upper classes. One of the most famous scenes in the tale is the desecration of the corpse of the Trojan king's son, Hector, by the Greek hero Achilles. Achilles drags Hector's corpse tied to his chariot around the city walls of Troy. One of the main motives of the Iliad is also Achilles' anger, one of the bad qualities that Seneca laments having penetrated Roman society from a foreign land. Now, as we said, the Iliad had been compulsory reading for Roman elites. Therefore, it does not seem too far-fetched that the Romans could have copied the Greeks' practice of desecrating corpses. Warner also draws attention to parallels with Hellenism and substantiates these archaeological findings. In addition to the case of Philip V, the Damnationes of Hipparchus in the 5th century BC, and that of the philosopher Demetrius of Phaleron in the 4th century BC should also be mentioned here. A continuity in the Greek condemnation of memory can be seen here, which allows the conclusion that the practice must have been an integral part of Hellenistic culture. Indeed, memory punishments were also anchored in Greek legislation. They served to maintain stability between hostile city-states and their rulers. At the same time, the condemnation of memory was used in this context as a deterrent measure. Traitors who defected to enemy cities were punished to prevent potential mass desertions, as Flower 2006 points out. Against the background of the well-documented use of commemorative punishments in the Greek legal context, Flower even goes so far as to say that they constituted an indispensable, quote, background to the study of their Roman counterparts, end quote. Now, we see that the practice of Damnatio Memoriae can clearly be traced back to Hellenistic culture. However, as mentioned at the beginning, Augustus strives to distance himself from Greek values and cultural influences, especially as his rival Marcus Antonius was constantly accused of having too strong a Hellenistic orientation during his lifetime. As a side note in this regard, Halfman 2011 indicates that even after his death, the legend that Antony had allegedly intended to transform Rome into a, quote, Hellenistic-style kingdom, end quote, became established. In reality, these rumors go back to a, quote, smear campaign by Octavian, who wanted to prevent his rival's return to Rome and conceal his own quest for power. The adoption of a long-established Greek practice for punishing Antony's memory would have represented a break with the Augustan Revolution, if this movement was based on distancing itself from Hellenistic influences. Similar to Auctoritas and the renunciation of Hellenism, Roman virtues such as clementia and pietas are also central aspects of the Augustan Revolution. This is probably another one of the reasons why Augustus partially rehabilitates Marcus Antonius Memoria. The Clipeus Virtutis, a shield of honor awarded to Octavian by the Senate in 27 BC, reflects the importance of Clementia and Pietas for Augustan cultural policy, as Zanca 1996 emphasizes. From then on, these virtues were communicated in many ways, both through literature and the arts and crafts. Clementia, the clemency towards the defeated who submit to Roman authority, describes one of the most important virtues of Roman behavior. In this context, Galinsky refers to Vergil's Aeneid. In his prophetic speech about the future Roman heroes, Anchises, the father of Aeneas, outlines the ideal model for their behavior. Quote, Roman, remember by your strength to rule earth's peoples, for your arts are to be these: to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, battle down the proud. End quote. During his lifetime, Julius Caesar was also said to have shown a certain clemency towards his enemies. Augustus follows the example of his adoptive father. He decides to partially rehabilitate Antony's Memoria and at the same time conceals the painful memory of the earlier conflict. This clemency, however, only serves Augustus' own political ends, remember. While Antony's name is reinstated in the highly symbolic Fasti Consularis, his portraits continue to be thoroughly destroyed. The images were equated with the persons themselves. This means an attack on a statue was equivalent to an attack on the body, or corpse for that matter, of the person itself. The widespread destruction of Antony's images was equivalent to a number of attacks on his body itself. Against this background, the term clemency does not really seem appropriate, although Octavian had previously arranged for the embalming and burial of Antony's body. Antony's younger son, Iulus, and his younger siblings are granted protection and are accepted into the Domus Augusta, which means Augustus' home. Antyllus, Antony's eldest son, who had previously fought alongside him and was thus a potential heir, had to die. And we'll come back to Antony's Memoria with regard to these family constellations in a few minutes. But what we find here is Augustus calculating which of Antony's children are okay to live and which have to die for his political objectives. Pretty cold-blooded, I might say. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of clemency to me. Maybe we could settle for the term well-calculated clemency in this context. Pietas, or loyalty to gods, family, and fatherland, is probably the most significant virtue on Augustus' shield of honor, as it communicates social responsibility and Romanitas. Romanitas refers to a set of virtues regarded as traditionally Roman. Those are qualities that existed long before the Augustan revolution of the Roman state and cultural system, but from then on gain exponential popularity in artistic depictions as part of the Principate's cultural program, and they are also propagated in this way throughout the Roman Empire. Now think about how important those images must have been as means of communication, especially as the majority of the Roman population was illiterate, right? The image of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises out of the burning Troy, as depicted on the altar of the Gens Augusta, is probably a particularly significant example. Just as Aeneas is loyal to his father Anchises, Augustus shows pietas towards his deified adoptive father Julius Caesar, thereby further legitimizing his rule, as Galinsky points out. We learn that pietas encompasses loyalty to the family, and Augustus instrumentalizes this virtue brilliantly. At the zenith of his political alliance, Octavian offered Antony the hand of his sister Octavia in order to settle earlier disputes and maintain his position in the struggle for power. Antony accepts the offer, he marries Octavia and becomes Octavian's brother-in-law. Loyalty to the family would forbid a war between relatives, which is presumably why Octavian declared war on Cleopatra and not on Antony himself. Octavian did not want to carry the civil war from Pharsalos via Philippi to Actium and Alexandria. The conflict should not be perceived as a continuation of the civil wars, even if it was exactly that, of course, as Michael Rathmann emphasizes. Just a few words on Cleopatra before we move on. Both Dio and Plutarch have her declared hostis, which means enemy of the state. If their narrations are true, she happens to be, quote, the only woman for whom there's historical evidence of her proclamation as an official enemy of the Roman state, end quote, as Warner emphasizes. Although we've talked about Octavian's efforts to portray the civil war as a conflict between Rome and a foreign power, there's no evidence of the systematic destruction or removal of Cleopatra's images after her suicide. In fact, we've looked at the passage from Plutarch where he describes the destruction of Antony's images at Alexandria, and I'm going to quote it again here. Quote, now the statues of Antony were torn down, but those of Cleopatra were left standing, because Archibius, one of her friends, gave Caesar 2,000 talents in order that they might not suffer the same fate as Antony's. End quote. Apparently, Octavian was bribed into sparing her images, and indeed, 3 surviving images are on display to this day in Vatican, Berlin, and Churchill. Eventually, Octavian propagates his triumph at Actium as a victory over Egypt and the Queen. Antony, on the other hand, was concealed in order to avoid further reminders of the civil war. Indeed, the image of a dispute between brothers was certainly still very present within the Roman population, as Caesar and Pompey, and before them Marius and Sulla, had just recently engaged in deadly conflicts. Even Rome's founding legend is based around 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus, fighting each other to death. Instead, Augustus is clearly striving for unity and harmony in the sense of pietas. Now let's move on to the Domus Augusta and Antonius' descendants. The admission of Antony's children to the Domus Augusta, House of Augustus, can also be assessed in terms of Clementia and Pietas. As modern observers, we're quick to assume that Augustus had become a surrogate father for the children of his former rival out of pure charity, right? But This would falsely equate today's standards of familial attachment with those of the 1st century BC. In fact, the godfatherhood of Augustus, who becomes an avunculus as the brother of a mother, is once again a clever and well-calculated move to legitimize his rule, as it turns out. Augustus is merely fulfilling social norms and expectations as a patron saint, as the pioneer of a new social system of godparenthood to solve the demographic problem of fatherless children in Rome. He merely instrumentalizes long-established Roman family strategies to his own political ends, we have to say. The role of surrogate father becomes a vehicle for the public display of clementia and pietas, those two concepts for legitimizing claims to power. At the same time, the integration of Antony's children into his household means that Augustus is better able to control them. Iulus is thus prevented from running his own household, as he is already part of the Domus Augusta. Also, his new rule as nephew of the princeps created a relationship of dependency with Augustus. The same is also true for Cleopatra's children. They are also forced into this dependency. Otherwise, they might have been able to reflect on their Ptolemaic roots, right? Beyond motives of legitimizing his rule, Augustus' decision to include the Antonians in his own family and to limit sanctions against Antony himself can also be understood in other ways. On the one hand, this approach represents a return to the modus operandi of the Middle Republic, right? In which attempts were made to resolve conflicts within the family so as not to jeopardize family prestige and keep all career options open for the descendants, right? On the other hand, this tactic represents an obvious rejection of the political sanctions of the late Republic. Flower also ascribes particular importance to the inclusion of Octavia, her external image as Antony's legitimate wife and a model of Roman family values, must have also been very beneficial to Augustus' cause. In the run-up to the Battle of Actium, Octavian's propaganda had publicly stigmatized Antony as a traitor to his fatherland and his family. After his return from Egypt, however, Augustus pursued more discreet methods in dealing with Antony's memory. The air quote traitor was now to be dealt with within the family, away from the public. However, contrary to the princeps' objectives, the memoria of his former rival is revived and flourished over the course of time, even until the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Various family members will repeatedly rehabilitate the memory of Antonius. The first of these was Antony's eldest surviving son, Iulus, whose name alone was a reminder of his biological father's close connection to the Julian family, right? Iulus openly acknowledged his descent, not least by naming his son Lucius Antonius instead of Marcus, which had of course been prohibited as part of the damnatio. Antony's two daughters from his marriage to Octavia enjoy an excellent education in keeping with their origins and are married off in a manner befitting their status. Their names also keep the memory of Antonius alive, of the two Antonias. The younger one, in particular, would go on to become one of the most famous and influential women in Rome. In her son, Germanicus, Antony is to a certain extent reborn. The young man's lifestyle is strongly reminiscent of his grandfather, and like Antony, he too enjoys great popularity among the people of Rome. However, this resemblance of the young prince also arouses the ire of certain contemporaries. During the visit to the eastern provinces ordered by Tiberius in 18 AD, Germanicus not only visits the victory monuments of his great-uncle, meaning Augustus, but also the place where his grandfather's camp had once stood. His companion, Calpurnius Piso, also criticizes Germanicus for his alleged politeness towards the Athenians. Remember, Antonius had been criticized heavily for his sympathy towards Greek influences, and Augustus' propaganda had even accused him of wanting to relocate the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria, right? Germanicus' visit to Egypt, which he had not previously agreed with Tiberius, earns him a reprimand from the emperor. He is said to have moved through Alexandria without a bodyguard and in Greek clothing, as his grandfather Antonius had once done. Germanicus' journey to historical sites of the ancient pharaonic empire must have tried Tiberius' patience beyond measure. It was not without reason that senators during Augustus' reign were only allowed to enter Egypt by his permission. They had not yet recovered from the trauma of Antony's alliance with Cleopatra. The parallels between Germanicus and his grandfather become the focus of attention when the young prince dies unexpectedly in the year 19. The suspicious Tiberius was said to be envious of his extremely popular potential successor. Instead of the emperor, however, Germanicus' opponent Calpurnius Piso becomes the scapegoat of the resulting state crisis. Tiberius' successor was therefore not to be Germanicus, but Gaius Caesar, known as Caligula. He builds on the persecutions and misfortunes that Germanicus' family had suffered under Tiberius. Under Caligula's rule, Antony's Memoria is therefore completely rehabilitated and upgraded even. Caligula bans the quinquennial celebrations of the victory of Actium and thus openly invokes his descent from Antony, while at the same time spurning the memory of Augustus, as Suetone tells us. He grants his grandmother Antonia the honorary title of Augusta. She had taken Gaius into her household after the death of his father. Her household had been influenced by Egyptian traditions, and indeed, Caligula is particularly well disposed towards the Eastern princes. But from then on, he also favors members of the Jewish ruling dynasty, whose friendship he had inherited through his grandmother. As with Germanicus, Caligula's behavior also shows unmistakable similarities to Antony's habitus, which manifests itself in his ostentatious appearance, his preference for, quote, Egyptianizing forms of ruler self-promotion, end quote, as Halfman puts it. His proximity to the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis in Rome, and the planning of a trip to Alexandria. After the death of his nephew Caligula, Emperor Claudius also declares his allegiance to the Antonians. Antony's grandson, once again, honors his grandfather's birthday. He does this by celebrating his father Drusus's birthday with a special ceremony because it happens to fall on the same day. He also names one of his daughters Claudia Antonia, by the way. The reception of Antony in literature also enjoys more positive developments under Claudius. Seneca, for example, describes him as an, quote, important personality of noble character. If his miserable drunkenness and love for Cleopatra had not made him an enemy of the state, and an inferior one at that, end quote. Admitted, while the latter part of the description might not sound too positive, it certainly takes away some responsibility from Antony. He is depicted as the good guy who supposedly just fell prey to his vices. And indeed, that womanizer and drunkard image has been the predominant characterization of Antony forever, unjustly so, mind you. But, of course, both Caligula and Nero, throughout their lives, truly did no service to the memory of Antony either, as Harder's 2018 stresses. Rather, their reigns of terror confirmed the distorted image of the triumvirate, an image that originated in Augustan literature. Now, we've talked about the Damnatio of Antonius, which established a precedent for future memory condemnations. We've discussed the handling of his Memoria under Augustan reign and throughout time in much detail. What I suggest now is we move through some of the most prominent imperial age examples of Damnatio Memoriae in much quicker fashion, and we just jump across the timeline chronologically, from one emperor to another. Caligula's name has become synonymous with the excesses and debauchery of the early empire, and indeed he is the first of Rome's emperors to be assassinated and to suffer a damnatio memoriae. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula by the troops of his father Germanicus, was born on the 31st of August AD 12. On the 18th of March 37, he succeeds his great-uncle Tiberius as the third emperor of Rome, at the age of 24. Initially, Caligula's reign was viewed as a welcome change from the repressive policies of Tiberius. However, Caligula's relations with the senatorial aristocracy eventually soured as a result of the emperor's increasingly megalomaniacal behavior. Caligula was assassinated during the Ludi Palatini on the 24th of January 41, together with his wife Milonia Caesonia and his infant daughter Julia Drusilla. As Suetone tells us, the murders of Caesonia and Drusilla may have occurred slightly after that of Caligula. Dio adds the additional gruesome detail that some of Caligula's assassins ate the flesh from his corpse. End quote. So Warner tells us that Caligula is very popular in the beginning, right? But soon his relationship with the Senate sours, and he's eventually assassinated during the so-called Ludi Palatini. The Ludi Palatini were public games, typically organized in honor of the emperor, and usually set on the Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace was located. Caligula is assassinated during these games, and if we can believe Dio's account, although we should, of course, take this with a grain of salt, his assassins go even further and start eating flesh from his corpse. Now, this is either dramatization, or if we think about poena post mortem, that means punishment after death. It does make sense that they would have done such a horrible, horrible thing, right? Anyways, the Senate seeks to officially condemn his memory after his death, but Caligula's uncle and successor Claudius, who may or may not have been involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Caligula, refuses to allow formal sanctions and does not want to declare the anniversary of Caligula's death a public holiday. Claudius does allow the images of Caligula to be removed at night and his actions to be annulled. Presumably, this nighttime operation that Cassius Dio tells us about is nothing but a concealment tactic that Claudius ordered in the removal of the portraits of Caligula. Claudius must have hoped that this would preserve the remaining family honor, which in turn would represent an important starting point for him to legitimize his own rule. As Yucker 1982 points out, as an additional insult, Caligula's remains are not interred in the mausoleum of his great-grandfather Augustus, but are instead buried in the imperial gardens on the Esquiline. According to Sueton, Caligula's corpse was only partially cremated and then hastily buried. His spirit was reported to have haunted the Esquiline gardens and the palace on the Palatine Hill until Caligula's two surviving sisters, Agrippina Minor and Julia Livilla, completed the cremation and properly interred his remains. Since we were just talking about punishment after death, Caligula's exclusion from the mausoleum of Augustus probably served as a posthumous act of disinheritance from the Julian gains, meaning Caligula is removed from Julian family history, right? A fate that, by the way, also befalls Julia Major, Julia Minor, and Caligula's mother, Agrippina Major, and also his brothers Nero and Drusus Caesar. Now, looking at all of this, we might ask ourselves, why did Claudius veto an official damnatio by the Senate in the first place? What's the point? And the answer is actually quite simple and trivial, because clearly the senatorial condemnation of Caligula's memory also reflects negatively on the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty, and ultimately Claudius's own legitimacy and fitness to rule, right? In fact, immediately after Caligula's murder, the Senate considers abolishing the memories of all the Julio-Claudians and destroying their temples even. What's more is that, remember that during his lifetime, Caligula enjoyed quite considerable popularity among certain segments of the Roman populace, particularly the Praetorian Guard and the plebs. As a result, Claudius finds it politically advantageous to bring Caligula's assassins to trial and execute them, probably aiming to appeal to the lingering support for Caligula. At the same time, by allowing this unofficial but de facto damnatio, which involves the removal and replacement of Caligula's portraits, as well as the erasure of his name from inscriptions, Claudius manages to maintain favor with the disillusioned senatorial aristocracy, who still view Caligula as a mad and dangerous tyrant. Despite its unofficial status, therefore, Caligula's damnatio and the treatment of his sculptures set important precedents for the condemnation of future emperors, as with earlier condemned members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Representations of Caligula are removed from public view, deliberately mutilated, or altered to resemble other figures, most often Claudius or Augustus. Moving on to Nero. Like Caligula before him, Nero symbolizes the archetype of the decadent and tyrannical emperor, utterly corrupted by the absolute power he wields. Nero is born on the 15th of December 37 in Actium. Originally named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, he is the son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Agrippina the Younger. In AD 49, Agrippina marries the reigning emperor, which was Claudius at that time. Shortly after, in AD 50, she persuades Claudius to adopt her son, giving him the names Nero Claudius Drusus Germanicus. On October 13th, AD 54, at the age of 16, Nero succeeds his great-uncle and adoptive father as emperor. Initially, he rules under the close supervision of Agrippina, but by AD 55, her influence begins to fade. His Praefectus Praetorio, Sextus Avranius Burrus, and his tutor, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, gain control. It is under their guidance that Nero governs well during the early years of his reign. However, in 62, Burrus dies, and Seneca is dismissed from Nero's service. Nero's increasingly autocratic behavior, along with his strong focus on artistic pursuits, alienates the traditionally minded members of the senatorial aristocracy. Relations between the emperor and the senate steadily worsen, and alleged plots against Nero's life lead to widespread persecutions of prominent citizens in Rome. Then there's the devastating fire of AD 64, combined with several disturbances on the borders of the empire, and all of this contributes to a decline in his popularity, particularly among the military. During the final years of his reign, Nero fails to restore public confidence in his ability. In March of AD 68, the governor of Gallia Lucturnensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, revolts against the emperor. Soon after, Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, and Lucius Clodius Macer, legatus in Africa, also rebel. Nero takes no immediate action against the usurpers and cannot regain control. As a result, abandoned by most of the army and the Senate, Nero commits suicide with the help of his freedman Epaphroditus on June 9th, AD 68. Galba succeeds him as the new emperor. Nero's body is not mutilated after his death, and his funeral is carried out at a considerable cost of around 200,000 sesterces. He is cremated in white robes embroidered with gold, and his nurses, Alexandria and Ecloge, along with his mistress, Acte, place his ashes in the tomb of his paternal ancestors, the Domitii. The Domitii is a funerary complex located on the Collis Hortulorum, or modern-day Pincio, or Pincio, not entirely sure how to pronounce it. His monument consists of a porphyry container for his ashes, solium. It is topped with an altar made of Luna marble, all surrounded by an enclosure of Thasian marble. Despite these elaborate funeral arrangements and decorations, Nero's remains are not interred in the mausoleum of Augustus, like Julia Major, Julia Minor, Agrippina Major, Nero, Drusus Caesar, Caligula, and Agrippina Minor before him. Nero's exclusion from the mausoleum signifies a posthumous and powerful symbolic removal of his place within the Julian gens, the family into which Claudius had formally adopted him. This exclusion acts as a deliberate tarnishing of his legacy and reputation. Nero is the first emperor to be officially declared a hostis by the Roman Senate. The Senate seeks to execute Nero in the manner traditionally reserved for hostes, which involves stripping the offender, holding him with a forked stick, and beating him to death with rods. Suetonius provides a detailed description of this traditional punishment in his account of Nero's final moments. Nero's declaration of hostis also leads to posthumous sanctions against his monuments and inscriptions. Pliny the Elder records that Nero's crimes are condemned. Suetonius indicates that Nero's publicly displayed images play important roles in the events leading to his overthrow. A placard is attached to one of his statues that reads in Greek, quote, "Now there will be a true contest and you will finally surrender," end quote. Another placard, also placed on a portrait of Nero, declares that the emperor, quote, "deserves the sack," end quote, referring to the traditional punishment for parricide, the poena culei, in which the condemned is sewn into a sack with a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster, supposedly, then thrown into the water, usually the Tiber. This reference to parricide recalls the murder of Nero's mother, Agrippina Minor, and may also metaphorically suggest Nero's murder of the Roman fatherland, the Patria. Historical sources and surviving archaeological evidence confirm that the destruction of Nero's portraits, monuments, inscriptions, and coins is aggressively carried out under Galba and Vespasian. During the revolt of Vindex, the troops of Rufus Gallus overthrow and destroy Nero's statues, foreshadowing the destruction of the emperor's images after his death. Immediately following Nero's death, the mob also protests against the dead emperor and drags his statues through the Forum Romanum. Tacitus quotes Nero's successor, Galba, who says that there is no previous example of a condemned emperor, which was true at the time. Speaking of Galba, let's move on to him. Servius Sulpicius Galba is the son of Gaius Sulpicius Galba and Mummia Achaica, both from prominent patrician families. Born in 3 BC, Galba holds several important positions throughout his career. This includes the governorship of Aquitania, the consulship in AD 33, the command of Upper Germany, proconsulship of Africa, and eventually the governorship of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba is initially supported by the Praetorians. Galba, however, goes on and dismisses Nymphidius, their prefect, and refuses to pay promised bonuses. As a result, the Praetorians quickly become dissatisfied with him. There's also growing resentment among the 1st and 5th legions stationed in Germany, and soldiers even throw stones at Galba's statues when asked to renew their oath of allegiance to him. The 4th and 22nd legions in Upper Germany expressed their anger by attacking Galba's images and smashing them to pieces. Finally, the troops in Lower Germany completely reject Galba's authority and declare Vitellius emperor on the 2nd of January 69. Meanwhile, in Rome, Otho successfully plots Galba's overthrow. The emperor is murdered in the Forum Romanum, along with his adopted son and heir, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Frugi Licinianus, by members of the Praetorian Guard on January 15th. The bodies of both Galba and Piso are denigrated, their heads are severed, and Galba's head may even be further desecrated by being thrown into the Caesorium, a place of execution for condemned criminals. Otho is subsequently proclaimed emperor by the Praetorians, and their choice is quickly ratified by the Senate. Visual images of Galba remain deeply involved in the events surrounding his overthrow. Just before his murder, his imago is torn from a military standard and thrown on the ground as a symbol of the soldiers' rejection of him in favor of Otho. After his murder, Galba's portraits in the capital are destroyed. Following Otho's own overthrow, Tacitus records that images of Galba are paraded through the city and garlands are placed over the Lacus Curtius, the site of his murder in the Forum. Galba's rehabilitation begins after Vespasian's rise to power. One of Vespasian's generals, Antonius Primus, orders statues of Galba to be re-erected, providing important evidence that these images are still accessible and well preserved. So they were likely stored in warehouses or storerooms, right? The Senate also votes to restore Galba's honors and even expresses a desire to erect a memorial to him right at the site of his murder in the Forum. The Senate, trying to restore Galba's honors, again reinforces the assumption that sanctions against his memory and portraits must have indeed been imposed after his assassination, right? Although we see this rehabilitation of Galba's memory, Vespasian does not fully support it. as he refuses to allow the proposed monument in the Forum. Let's move on to Otho or Otto. Marcus Salvius Otto is born in AD 32. He is the second husband of Poppaea Sabina. After Nero becomes interested in Poppaea, he appoints Otho as governor of Lusitania, probably to remove Otho from the capital. During the final days of Nero's reign, Otho supports Galba, hoping to be named his successor. However, Galba rejects Otho and instead names Lucius Calpurnius Piso Frugi Licinianus as his heir. In response, Otho arranges the murders of both Galba and Piso. Now, with Otho's reign, what's interesting is we witness the tendency to revive the Memoria of Nero and continue his regime. Remember how, as a result of the Senate resolution of June 68, portraits of Nero had been removed from many households, but apparently they were not destroyed. In the course of this political development, many of the portraits that had previously been removed were apparently once again to be found in the homes of private individuals, as Tacitus tells us. The memory of the emperor who was so hated by many was apparently honored by others, not only in private but also in public. The tomb of Nero was maintained and his statues were erected in the Forum. In addition, his edicts and merits were remembered among the people. But even among the senators, the memory of Nero had not been forgotten. He had bestowed special honors on many of them during his lifetime. Once again, we see that Memoria is negotiable. While, according to Suetonius, a large proportion of the people, quote, ran through the whole city with liberty caps on their heads, end quote, in joy at Nero's death. Others, in turn, apparently harbored thoroughly positive memories of the deceased emperor. Otho's rise to power is immediately challenged by Vitellius, who eventually defeats Otho's forces outside Cremona, prompting Otho to take his own life on the 16th of April 69. Under his successor, Otho's memory is condemned and his name is erased from inscriptions. Otho's birthday is officially declared a dies nefastus, as Salvius Coceanus is executed under Domitian for celebrating his uncle's birthday. Otho also faces a kind of literary damnatio in Juvenal's satires, where his reputation and memory are denigrated. Let's move on to Vitellius. Aulus Vitellius is born in AD 15. His father, Lucius Vitellius, is an important advisor to Claudius and holds 3 consulships. Aulus Vitellius himself holds a consulship under Claudius in 48 and is later named proconsul to Africa. In 68, Galba appoints him to command the restless troops stationed in Lower Germany. On the 2nd of January 69, shortly after assuming command, Vitellius is hailed as emperor by his new forces. Right after Galba's murder, Vitellius' troops, led by Fabius Valens and Aulus Caecinia Alienus, march into Italy and defeat Otho and his forces north of Cremona. As a result, Otho commits suicide, and the soldiers and Senate in Rome formally recognize Vitellius as the new emperor. However, the troops stationed in the east refuse to recognize Vitellius as the legitimate princeps and instead declare support for Vespasian. Vitellius manages to hold the capital for some time, but his forces are ultimately either defeated or defect to Vespasian's cause. On the 20th of December 69, Vitellius is dragged to the Forum and forced to endure the indignities of a common criminal. He is insulted by the populace, made to watch his statues being toppled, pelted with dung, and finally tortured to death on the Gemonian stairs. His corpse is mutilated and then dragged by a hook and thrown into the Tiber, a fate reserved for traitors, capital offenders, and victims of the arena. Vitellius is the first emperor to suffer such a public desecration. A shocking act of denigration, which was probably meant to assert loyalty to his victorious rival Vespasian. Vitellius's violent and bloody end reflects his Damnatio Memoriae, as does the destruction of his images. As troops defect to Vespasian's side, Vitellius's portraits are destroyed and replaced with depictions of Vespasian. Additionally, Vitellius's character and reign are constantly vilified by ancient authors. In the Historia Augusta, he is closely associated with other condemned emperors, including Nero, Domitian, and Elagabalus. It's really not surprising that the condemnations of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius follow the precedents set by Caligula and Nero. Although the reigns of all three were brief, they generate commemorative monuments that are attacked and destroyed eventually. Portraits of Vitellius are repurposed into images of his immediate successor, Vespasian. And we see the significant role that artistic representations play in these violent periods of political transition. Legionaries are recorded as destroying and throwing stones at Galba's images to express their dissatisfaction with his rule. Also, just before his assassination, his imago is ripped from a military standard to visually signal his overthrow. Later, in AD 69, Vitellius is forced to watch the destruction of his portraits before his murder. Like Sejanus, Vitellius witnesses the mutilation of his own images as a form of artistic pre-enactment of the desecration of his corpse, which, as we know, is abused by the populace and eventually thrown into the Tiber. Following Nero as the second emperor to suffer an officially mandated Damnatio Memoriae is Domitian. Titus Flavius Domitianus is born on the 24th of October AD 51 on the Quirinal in Rome. The second surviving son of future Emperor Titus Flavius Vespasianus and Flavia Domitilla Major. During the reigns of his father Vespasian and his brother Titus, Domitian holds prestigious but largely ceremonial positions. After the premature death of Titus on the 13th of September 81, Domitian eventually succeeds to the principate. He proves to be a skilled administrator and capable general, but his reign, like those of Caligula and Nero, is marred by significant conflicts with the Senate, which are even worsened by his increasingly autocratic behavior. Domitian's more monarchical approach to power becomes evident with his assumption of the title Censor Perpetuus in 85, his salutation as Dominus et Deus, and the renaming of September and October as Germanicus and Domitianus in his honor. Following his despotic actions and the brutal persecution of the Senate, Domitian is assassinated on the 18th of September 96. His wife, Domitia Longina, is implicated in the plot. Although Domitian remains popular with the soldiers, who called for his immediate deification, by the way, and the punishment of his assassins, the Senate defies their wishes and instead votes to erase his inscriptions and abolish his memory. By the 4th century, Domitian becomes the archetype of the condemned tyrant, and Lactantius states that even the memory of Domitian's name is erased, explaining that the Senate intends to leave no trace of the emperor's images or titles. Pliny the Younger offers us a vivid and striking account of the destruction of Domitian's portraits. Quote, "However, his," meaning Domitian's, "countless golden statues and a heap of rubble and ruin were offered as fitting sacrifice to the public joy. It was a delight to smash those arrogant faces to pieces in the dust, to threaten them with the sword and savagely attack them with axes, as if blood and pain would follow every single blow. No one controlled their joy and long-awaited happiness when vengeance was taken in beholding his likenesses hacked into mutilated limbs and pieces, and above all, in seeing his savage and hideous portraits hurled in the flames and burned up in order that they might be transformed from things of such terror and menace into something useful and pleasing." End quote. From Pliny's account, we see that Domitian's images are perceived as living beings, as if they were capable of experiencing pain. Their brutal mutilation, therefore, symbolizes the collective destruction of the emperor himself in effigy. Pliny also tells us about how Domitian's portraits are transformed into practical and pleasing objects. Of course, we have to take Pliny's account with a grain of salt, because it is far from impartial, as it is framed within a panegyric, meaning a public speech or a published text in praise of someone. So Pliny's probably praising Trajan, who is presented by contemporary writers as the complete opposite of the tyrannical Domitian. Despite the official damnatio, Domitian's nurse, Phyllis, cremates his body at her villa on the Via Latina and secretly deposits the ashes at the temple of the Flavian Gains on the Quirinal, next to the house where Domitian was born. The burial of Domitian's body by his nurse directly recalls the burial of Nero by his nurses, right? Alexandria and BABCOCK, you remember? we're moving nearly a century ahead when we talk about Commodus. A lot of things have changed by now, and imperial images are treated differently following condemnation. While portraits continue to be removed and destroyed, the practice of recarving sculpted likenesses largely ceased. Unlike with images of Caligula, Nero, and Domitian, none of Commodus's marble portraits were reworked after his condemnation. Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus is born on the 31st of August 161 in Lanuvium as the eldest surviving son of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and Annia Galeria Faustina Minor. In 177 he is made co-Augustus with his father and joins him in campaigns against the Marcomanni. Commodus succeeds Marcus Aurelius on the 17th of March 180 and adopts the name Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus. After becoming emperor, Commodus ends the war with the Marcomanni by signing a treaty. He brings a period of relative peace to the German frontier. He returns to Rome in October 180, and opposition to him emerges early during his reign. By 182, his sister Lucilla and his wife Crispina are involved in a plot against him. Commodus's harsh treatment of the senatorial elite and his erratic, megalomaniacal behavior fueled growing instability both in Rome and across the empire. So we see again that as an emperor you're better off not messing with the senatorial elite, right? Because those are the guys that will bring you to fall eventually if you lose their sympathy. Anyways, Commodus further scandalizes the elite by performing publicly as a gladiator and charioteer, as you might have seen in the movie Gladiator. He often forces members of the Senate to attend his performances. Much of his propaganda seeks to associate him with Hercules, renaming Rome as Colonia Commodiana, Carthage as Alexandria Commodiana Togata, and even renaming the month of the year to reflect his names, his titles, and his connection to Hercules. After the plot involving Lucilla and Crispina, several others attempt to dispose Commodus. Finally, on the 31st of December 192, so almost 10 years later, Commodus is strangled in his bath by his wrestling companion, the athlete Narcissus. Other people involved in this deadly plot are said to be his chamberlain Eclectus, the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Laetus, and his successor Publius Helvius Pertinax. Pertinax convenes the Senate to confirm his position as emperor and votes to erase all memory of Commodus. They call for the obliteration of the memory of the so-called, quote, impure gladiator. Commodus is declared a public enemy and his honors are revoked. His name is again removed from inscriptions, particularly from buildings that others had constructed, but for which Commodus had taken the credit. And on January 2nd, Commodus's statues are indeed toppled. Dio tells us how the statues were torn apart limb by limb, and his portrayal of the mutilation of Commodus's statues as if they were his own body kind of mirrors Pliny's similar description of the destruction of Domitian's images, which we listened to before. Both the Senate and the people aim to desecrate Commodus's corpse, and they are planning to drag it to the Tiber with a hook, a fate traditionally reserved for the bodies of capital offenders. However, his body is secretly placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, and a funerary inscription is later erected in his honor. Dio adds that the people, desiring to mistreat Commodus's corpse, also desecrate his portraits. Later, the Senate declares that Commodus's burial was unlawful and unauthorized, and they reinforce his status as an enemy of the state, an outcast with no right to a proper burial. A lot of ancient accounts of Commodus's condemnation repeatedly use language related to the arena, associating his disposal and the abuse of his body with the treatment of noxii, or those condemned criminals who suffered posthumous penalties. We've come a long way from the late Republic precedents to the damnationes of 2nd century Imperial Age emperors. Of course, we had to focus on some of the more prominent cases. I mean, the Roman Empire during the entirety of its existence saw about 200 emperors come and go. So we picked out some of the most prominent Imperial Age emperors and looked at how their memory was treated after their death. Let us stop here and try to briefly summarize what we could learn from examining the examples at hand. What do they have in common, and what did damnatio mean in the end? Focusing not so much on the individual suffering from damnatio, but rather looking at it on a political scale. We see that the concept of damnatio memoriae refers to collective forgetting, particularly political forgetting, as Frank BERNSTEIN puts it. Political forgetting is a decision or agreement and thus involves communication. Remember Marius, who had once been declared public enemy? 20 years later, his Memoria is being rehabilitated under Julius Caesar's quaestorship. Or Antonius, whose memory is condemned by Augustus and later revived and upgraded even under Caligula's reign. Collective memory is not fixed. It is negotiated in a multitude of contexts and societal or political levels. Political forgetting was a conscious process. It aimed at suppressing certain memories, like crimes or unspeakable acts, so that they wouldn't circulate publicly. Of course, well, nothing was really forgotten. These memories were removed, or at least attempted to be removed from communication. However, again, even if memory was attempted to be removed from communication in public, individual memory may still have differed from public consensus, right? I mean, we talked about that Labienus guy, remember? Who brought to court that picture of Lucius Saturninus, the former tribune who had been stoned to death and whose memory had been condemned. If we may trust Cicero's account of that court scene, Labienus didn't care that Saturninus had been publicly discredited, right? He still carried that man's picture with him, publicly professing allegiance, which of course turned out to be detrimental to Labienus himself in the end. Anyways, as a political tool, forgetting acted as a way to calm internal conflicts. Think about how Augustus strived to bring peace to a civil war-ridden Roman society by deliberately forgetting his rivalry with Antonius and even portraying it as if the war had been against Cleopatra, not his fellow countryman and brother-in-law, by the way, Antonius. Sometimes Damnatio Memoriae was about suppressing specific memories, not through forgetting or repression in a deeply psychological sense, no. It was about keeping negative memories alive through communication. In many cases, that which is missing strikes you the most, doesn't it? Imagine a public list of triumphators, and someone's name is chiseled out. That missing name will stand out, right? That person's contemporaries will know exactly whose name was chiseled out, shaming that person publicly for as long as people would remember, and talk about whose name it was that is missing in that list. Political forgetting, such as through amnesty or silence in the public sphere, was often seen as the last resort to achieve internal peace. Again, remember how Augustus in his autobiography, which was meant for public reading by the way, deliberately concealed the name of his former rival Antonius. This just reinforces the difficulties that ancient political cultures must have had in dealing with conflict. For the Romans, the political imperative to forget was grounded in their ideal of inner peace. Again, as Frank BERNSTEIN points out, compromise was not seen as an option, and even a small dissent was viewed as a failure of politics. Total consensus was considered essential for stability, and this stability was not religious, but socially and politically determined. Political actions were justified not only by political thinking, but also by pre-political emotions and attitudes. Ancient societies were unwilling to tolerate differing opinions, and reconciliation was rare. Only appeasement was possible. This required political forgetting, and political forgetting, of course, could be enforced through amnesty or tacit agreement as a means to maintain peace. Memory and forgetting were closely intertwined in this process. Although internal conflicts might not have been fully resolved, collective forgetting could at least try to contain and control those conflicts. In Rome, political forgetting was a preventive measure, a tool aiming to stop conflict from resurfacing. The discussion of Damnatio Memoriae reveals a searching approach, as we cannot fully understand the ancient practice of political forgetting still, due to differences in our political culture and understanding. Unlike us, the Romans chose repression over coming to terms with the past. They deliberately avoided further dialogue a practice that is now unacceptable and unthinkable in the modern political process, especially in the era of mass media. That ancient Roman idea of total consensus and rejection of dissent, it really contrasts sharply with our modern ideals of pluralism and minority recognition. While this mindset still exists in some parts of the world, we should be grateful that, for many of us, there is no more political forgetting.